Swords, they're cool, but how do they work? Good question. It's surprisingly complicated. Or maybe I've just made it really complicated. I don't care. People often break down sword movements into thrusting or cutting, but that's not true. There's a third type of action, which is chopping. Isn't that just cutting? No, it's different, and I'm going to explain how. Mainly through an overly technical and detailed breakdown of how each kind of blade action works. And we'll explore what kinds of design elements lend themselves to either thrusting, cutting, or chopping. Also note that any history or weapons evolution facts I give are going to be highly abridged and dumbed down. This is not a history video. This is a painfully simplified physics and engineering video. First up, thrusting swords. These are probably the easiest to understand. Thrusting favors thin, symmetrical blades such as the rapier, longsword, or even the Chinese yen. Hopefully I pronounced that right. Thrusting is very popular among late European swords. By putting your sword, your arm, and your target on the same line, thrusting allows you to put the momentum of your body behind each strike. This allows the sword itself to be lighter and more nimble because the force of the strike comes from the weight of your body, not the weight of the weapon. You can see that the balance point of my antique foil is stunningly close to the guard. Because it's a dedicated thrusting weapon, the center of mass can be as far back as physically possible and still be behind every strike. Thrusting swords benefit from smaller cross sections because thicker blades means we have to displace more material to fit inside our target. A thicker, fatter weapon means it has to push more meat out of the way to make room for its fatness. Displacing this material eats up the kinetic energy of the strike, leading to worse penetration. The sharper and more needle-like a point, the easier stabbing is going to be. This, of course, has to be balanced out by the concern for durability. You can't make a blade that's paper thin and expect it to hold up to the rigors of combat. However, what you can do is add distal taper, which is where your blade gets thinner as it moves closer to the tip. This gradual thickening of the blade creates a very shallow wedge, allowing material to be moved out of the way more gradually and giving the user a greater mechanical advantage. This allows blades to retain a reasonable amount of durability, allowing for a smaller and thinner point, increasing its ability to penetrate a target. And it also reduces the sword's weight, making it less tiring for the user. Compare these traits to a cutting sword like the katana. And yes, this is a very crappy katana, I know. I got this when I was like 12 for $20. The katana's thick spine and small to non-existent distal taper means it ends up compressing material in front of the point instead of smoothly moving it out of the way, which creates more friction. This isn't to pick on the katana, it's merely to point out the difference between blades that specialize in thrusting and those that don't. While distal taper is one way to minimize the effective cross-sectional area, it's far from the only option. You can actually see variations in cross-section when you compare a classic longsword to an S-stock. While quite good at thrusting, the classic longsword is technically a cut and thrust blade, meaning it has many compromises in its design. The S-stock, however, is essentially a longsword, but it specializes much more heavily in the thrust. As a result, it has a narrower blade, and many versions of the S-stock also lack an edge. That's right, the quest to reduce cross-sectional area became so extreme that some swords did away with edges entirely. You see, having an edge means having an edge taper. And having an edge taper means having a larger cross-section. So weaponsmiths eventually asked themselves, what if we just removed the edges? And that's how we got big needles like the small sword, which are edgeless and incapable of cutting, in exchange for reduced weight and an absurdly well-developed thrusting ability. So dedicated thrusting swords are typically very nimble and have even been known to sacrifice their ability to cut in order to increase thrusting potential. But the main takeaway is that thrusting swords rely on small cross-sectional areas and very tapered points to maximize penetration. On the other hand, cutting swords are quite a bit different and noticeably more complicated. Cutting, or slashing if you prefer, favors broad, single-edged curved blades with a lot of edge area. The outwards curve found on many cutting swords is actually important for a few different reasons. First of all, it allows the sword to correct its own edge alignment. When a blade strikes a target, it has inertia. This means that it wants to continue moving its mass in the direction of motion. When the sword makes contact past its center of mass, the curved blade will naturally rotate itself to align with the target. You can see that my practice katana always rotates itself edge down. Straight blades, on the other hand, naturally want to roll flat. And inward curving blades want to rotate all the way backwards. This allows outward curving blades to be easier to handle when cutting because their edge alignment naturally self-corrects. In addition, the outwards curve also concentrates the force of a strike because a smaller section of the cutting surface impacts the target, which means greater pressure and penetration for the same amount of force. The second thing the curve does is allow the sword swing to have the same effect on a target that a cam does on a follower. A cam and follower is a mechanism used in engineering to turn rotational motion into linear motion. It involves an oddly shaped rotating surface that spins around an axis, pushing a spring-loaded rod. Cutting swords act as cams by using their curves and the rotational motion of your swing to gradually cut into the target. But instead of pushing the target backwards, it just continues to cut deeper and deeper. In addition, this lets the entire length of the blade pass over a very small portion of the target. This allows the weapon to create a smaller, deeper cut instead of a longer, shallower cut, because penetration is essential when attempting to kill or disable your opponent. There's a persistent idea that curved swords create a continuous gash across the front of your target, but that's probably not what makes them effective. While you can see the cut that a curved sword creates, what you often can't see is the relevant depth of each part of that cut. Yes, a curved sword hitting a wide target will drag its edge across a large portion of that target. But the real advantage is how much of its blade drags over a small portion of that target. Compare an outward curving blade to other blade shapes. You can see that a straight blade or an inwards curving shape would hit the follower at too abrupt of an angle, and are less capable of making that gentle, gradual cut that allows cutting swords to get so deep. Straight blades that are used for cutting, like the long sword, often require you to hit your target and then pull or push to initiate a cut. However, this breaks the cut up into two separate motions and makes it difficult for you to use the momentum of your swing to cut. Instead, any force pushing into the target while slicing has to be generated by your wrists while you're pulling. Curved blades do not have this problem, as they allow you to cut with minimal pulling or pushing action by using their curves to translate your rotational motion into linear cutting motion. Thus, the cam and follower analogy. Interestingly, some historical swords have blades that start out straight or only slightly curved towards the hilt, but transition to a rather dramatic curve towards the point. This is because initial impact with a close-range target already involves your weapon being at a significant angle because of how your hands lead the strike when you swing. This means that even a fairly straight blade will provide a gradual slope to cut along if it's sufficiently angled. However, as we move further along on our cut, the blade starts to become more in line with the target, causing straighter blades to dig in. This necessitates a more noticeable curve towards the point in order to continue our cam and follower motion. You can even see this design element in many actual cams and followers, with the sides of the cam being flat before sharply curving towards the end. Because cutting swords achieve target penetration by running the length of their edge over a relatively small spot, a longer edge can help them cut more effectively. However, there is a difference between a longer edge and a longer blade. The length of your blade is the distance in a straight line from your guard to your point. The length of your edge is the total length of the path followed by the sharp part. A curved sword might have a comparatively short blade, but a comparatively long edge. This means that the cutting ability and reach of a sword are often fundamentally at odds, with a more noticeable curve giving you a smoother and more gradual cut, but simultaneously either sacrificing reach or significantly increasing weight by adding more material. Another design element common to cutting swords is a wide, flat blade. This allows the edge taper to be more gradual, leading to greater mechanical advantage. Remember in the last section I compared the longsword and the S-stock? Well, the longsword's wide blade is a compromise which gives it better cutting ability because of its sloped edges, but worse thrusting ability because of its greater cross-section. A greater edge taper is also part of the reason specialized cutting swords often have a single edge. If you have a double-edged weapon, you have to fit two wedge shapes in the same area, making each slope steeper and worse at cutting. Now, obviously, the idea of having a grind with a continuous slope from your edge to your spine would create an excessively delicate edge. But you can make the metal towards your edge at least thinner because you have a thick spine adding support. Ultimately, how sharply your blade tapers from edge to spine is going to be a balance between lethality and durability. But having a single edge can also help with durability because any impact with a target is going to impart a bending force on the blade. These bending forces are most prominent on the front and back of the blade and are less prominent in the middle. A double-edged sword is going to have the thinnest parts of its blade taking the largest amount of force. But a single-edged blade is able to take all the compressive forces from bending on a thick spine, making it a bit more resistant to warping when used for hard edge impacts. Plus, a double-edged cutting sword would only be able to have one edge with an outwards curve, making the other edge a lot less useful. Of course, having a wider blade also adds weight, but that's less of a problem with cutting swords. While thrusts have the force of your body behind them, cuts only have the momentum of your sword. This means that heavier blades with higher centers of mass might make your sword less agile, but it can also add energy to your cut. Essentially, cutting blades want to include an outwards curve, a broad blade with a gradual taper, a single edge, and a lot of edge area. However, these elements have to be balanced with the need for reach, agility, and durability. Now onto chopping blades. I understand that not everyone puts chopping and cutting swords into two separate categories, but I think it's important to do so. Some swords use a mechanism of action so different from what I described in the cutting section that they really need their own category. While cutting blades run their edge along a target to gradually slice their way deeper, chopping blades use momentum to slam a small portion of their blade as deep into the target as possible. These blades, like the kukri, kopis, or even the yataghan, are notable for their S-curve or recurve blade shapes and high centers of mass. A high center of mass increases the moment of inertia and requires more energy to stop. This means that it transfers a greater amount of energy into the target at the cost of making it less maneuverable. However, the most important feature of chopping swords revolves around their center of percussion, also known colloquially as the sweet spot in sports like baseball. The center of percussion is the point along the blade where, if impacted, will impart the largest amount of force into your target and the least amount of sting into your hands. It's going to be found somewhere between the center of mass and the tip of the blade. The center of mass is the point at which the weapon balances. I've taken the liberty of marking the center of mass with some tape. If Caitlin loosely holds the pommel of this sword, a strike at the center of mass should make it lurch backwards out of her grip. A strike at the very end of the blade, however, should make the weapon rotate around its center of mass and lurch forward out of her grip. I am now a science educator, so make the algorithm give me subscribers. Both a strike near the center of mass and at the tip are going to transfer some of the strike's energy into your hands. Not only does this give you the same telltale sting as when you swing a baseball bat at a brick wall, but it also wastes some of the energy of your strike by throwing some of that energy back into your hands. However, when you strike at the center of percussion, the sword rotates around the base of the pommel, meaning that a well-placed strike should allow Caitlin to hold onto the sword with just the tips of her fingers. Science. Hitting with this part of the blade means less hand sting and less energy loss, allowing all of that energy to penetrate the target. Now, sure, there's a sweet spot on every blade, but managing to hit that sweet spot is a different story. However, chopping blades have a really neat design trick that I believe can help make their strikes more consistent. Suppose for a moment that I'm hitting with the edge of a straight blade and want to hit on the center of percussion, which I have marked on this 2x4. If my weapon is angled backwards, I will miss the center of percussion. If my weapon is angled forwards, I will miss the center of percussion. Now suppose we put a massless semicircle on the leading edge of that weapon, with the center of the circle roughly being at the center of percussion. Force applied to a semicircle travels linearly along the radius. Now, slight changes in angle and distance allow the weapon to hit in a way where the center of percussion is still behind each impact. Now, this is my working theory. If you're an actual physicist that can do the math on this, please feel free to correct me. But if I'm right, this would reduce the sting in my hands and allow a higher percentage of the kinetic energy to travel into the target. Many blades actually achieve this effect by incorporating an S-curve or recurve design and giving the sword a more axe-like shape, effectively projecting a semicircle forward of the center of percussion. Now, despite this important difference in function, there are many similar design elements between chopping and cutting swords. Both prefer wide blades with a sharp edge and a gradual taper, and both benefit from high centers of mass. However, chopping swords make greater use of increased mass than cutting swords because of how directly their kinetic energy translates into penetration power. And while cutting swords often curve backwards to imitate a cam and follower, chopping swords instead angle forward to project a semicircle roughly in front of their center of percussion. As cool as these chopping design features are, they're often limited to short swords or long knives. Having the balance point at the far end of a 1-foot blade with a low overall mass is fine. Having the balance point at the far end of a 3-foot blade with a high overall mass becomes very difficult to wield. As you make the weapon larger, you have to start dedicating more of the weapon's surface to handle area to allow the user to separate their hands and better control the weapon. And at that point, why don't you just use an axe? You can see that longer chopping weapons like the yataghan or the falchion include many more compromises in their design than shorter chopping blades like the kukri or the kopis. Both the yataghan and the falchion have greatly reduced recurves, with many falchions dropping the curve entirely, and most yataghans have a much narrower blade to reduce weight. However, this necessity to keep chopping swords at a certain size can almost be viewed as an advantage. It can serve as a compact, easily carryable sidearm while still packing a considerable punch. When used as a secondary weapon or when paired as a shield, it's not a half-bad option, even with its shorter length. The Gladius is a thrusting-chopping hybrid, and it served its purpose pretty well. Now, let's take a step back for a second so we can do a comparison of the different strategies. While thrusting is very useful, if you want to go for pure kinetic energy, cutting or chopping is definitely your best option. Thrusting sounds like it would give you the most kinetic energy because you get the weight of your body behind it, but this really isn't true. First of all, the energy of my strike is only going to be as strong as the weakest link in the chain, which is usually my arm. Even if I get my entire body moving into a strike, any resistance when I hit the target is going to cause my arm to absorb the shock. A thrust is never going to be weak and meaningless because my arm can provide a decent amount of energy. However, at a certain point, my arm can't withstand the force, and getting more energy is going to be dependent on the momentum of the weapon itself. So if we have a thrusting sword and a chopping sword of the same weight, can't I just move them at the same speed to get the same amount of energy out of them? Well, in theory, yes, but in practice, no. Thrusting requires you to move at your target in a straight line. And as you likely know, a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. And while moving on this straight line might get your strike to the target very quickly, the short amount of time it takes can actually limit its kinetic energy. You see, as my sword moves through the air, my muscles are working to accelerate it. By taking a less direct route, a swinging motion gives me time to get my weapon up to a higher speed, resulting in a larger amount of kinetic energy. This can also make sense when you think about it intuitively. Will I be able to hit Bob harder if I start my swing from here or here? Obviously the second one, because I get more time to accelerate. And swinging motions being more powerful also makes sense when you stop to think about it. If I want to push a nail into a piece of wood, do I jab my hammer at it or do I swing my hammer at it? If you had to use a stick to hit a ball as far as possible, would you use it like a pool cue or a golf club? Swinging is more powerful, meaning that if you wanted to maximize kinetic energy, a cutting or chopping sword would be your best bet. However, this is assuming you have the time and space to do so. A big advantage of thrusting is that it can take a direct path and your arm can push through the target with reasonable force. Your arm has much better leverage in a push than it does in a swing, which is why dips are easy and the iron cross is really hard. Swinging can impart more kinetic energy than thrusting, but you have to have the time and space to build up speed. So while thrusting has a low ceiling on kinetic energy, it also has a very high floor. If my point is positioned directly against my opponent when I start thrusting them, I'm probably going to get some pretty good penetration. However, if my edge is against my opponent when I start trying to chop them, I have found myself on the losing end of a lever. While this sounds like thrusting would be more useful from short range, this is hampered by the fact that getting the tip of a full-length sword pointed at something 6 inches away from me is kind of difficult. But swinging a weapon at them, while not ideal, is at least simpler. So, as you may have guessed, there are pros and cons to each strategy. But while cutting and chopping swords both benefit from the kinetic energy gained in a long swinging motion, it's much more critical for chopping swords. Kinetic energy gives cutting swords good initial penetration and enough momentum to make its subsequent slicing motion a little easier. That being said, a cutting motion can still be useful even if you start by placing your edge against the target. You won't get as much penetration, but you can still get a good slice. Chopping weapons, however, are almost entirely dependent upon gaining kinetic energy, meaning that limiting your weapon's ability to gain speed because of either distance or confined environment is going to greatly impact its performance. Now, it's important to note that the distinction between cutting, thrusting, and chopping swords is not always so clean-cut. Get it? Cut? Despite the specific design elements I've laid out, most historical examples have noticeably compromised designs. While I have provided some extreme examples in this video, I did cherry pick them. Throughout history, having a sword that only thrusts, only cuts, or only chops is exceedingly rare. But you might be wondering which design strategy is better. And of course, it depends. All three of these strategies, and any combination thereof, are perfectly workable if given the right context. However, all of them share a common goal: maximize penetration. Penetration is one of the biggest determining factors of lethality. You can actually see this need for penetration when you look at axes that evolved for cutting wood and axes that evolved for fighting. The wood axes have fat bits designed for splitting wood without overly penetrating a log. The combat axes, however, have very thin bits in order to slide deeper into a target. When cutting wood, this just makes your blade over-penetrate and get stuck. But when fighting, getting that penetration is essential. If I have a 2-foot long, 1/4 inch deep cut across my torso, I'm still fighting. None of my muscles are severed and none of my vital organs are injured. I'm probably bleeding a lot, but that could take a while to kill me if it ever does. Even without medical attention, I could eventually heal and continue living my life. But if I have a 1-inch long, 6-inch deep wound on my torso, I'm in trouble. I might already be dead. And keep in mind that both of those wounds have the same total volume, meaning they require you to cut through the same amount of material. However, while penetration is important, you will eventually hit a point of diminishing returns. I can make a thrusting sword that can punch through you and stick out 2 feet from your back. But why? The 2 feet of blade coming out of your back is no longer helping. It isn't any deadlier than a sword that goes most of the way through you. I either put a hole in your organs or I didn't. In fact, having a sword that thrusts all the way through a target and bottoms out on the guard is actually too efficient. Much of the energy of my strike is being wasted by smacking my target with the guard. If I had given the blade a larger cross-section, I would have actually put a larger hole in my opponent. Likewise, if my cutting blade can effortlessly cleave 4 people in half with a single strike, who cares? In what universe am I going to have 4 enemies lined up like that? If you have a sword that thrusts far better than it has to, it would actually make more sense to compromise its design. That way, it could thrust well enough, but it could also hit with its edge. Or if it's already chopping its way through trees, it could also create a smooth cut that gives the blade an exit from the target. If you've hit a point of diminishing returns, make your sword do something else. Now, if you want to use the knowledge in this video to create the most specialized sword in history, more power to you. But remember that there's a reason most swords were a compromised design. The gladius is a great example. It has the length and kind of the recurve shape of a chopping sword, but it has a point and 2 edges, which indicates thrusting sword. And of course, in reality, it was used for both. It might not be amazing at either, but it's good enough at both of them. And having options is rarely a bad thing. You might also be wondering, is there only thrusting, cutting, and chopping? Or are there other strategies to design a sword around? Yes, but actually no. In theory, you can make a sword that hooks, whips, saws, or even abrades. The reason that you don't hear about those designs is because they suck. The Chinese hook sword is obviously a sword designed to hook, but it's difficult to use and weirdly balanced. It's only ever been used in the capacity of civilian martial arts and has never really found a use in warfare. People whose actual job was to fight with swords didn't like it. The Urumi is a sword that actually whips, but it fell out of favor millennia ago because it's very difficult to use and wildly impractical. It's only managed to survive in traditional martial arts systems because it looks super awesome. Seriously, go watch this video, it looks awesome. The closest thing I can find to a sawtooth sword is the Mesoamerican Macuatl, which used obsidian shards in place of a blade. However, an actual sawtooth sword will get caught on basically everything, and would be exceptionally difficult to sharpen. Saws are really only good to use against hard, stationary objects. I can't even saw through a steak without using my other hand to hold it in place. The only reason the Macuatl exists is because the region hadn't yet developed metalworking. Flakes of obsidian were the only super sharp things they had. Now, an abrading sword uses an extremely rough and abrasive surface to wear its way through a target, kind of like a giant file. It's also never existed because I just made it up. Swords that use actions other than thrusting, cutting, or chopping have seen little to no historical use, partly because other designs are often less effective and harder to use. If you want to coat a sword edge like a diamond saw blade, you're free to do so, but why? Are you literally fighting a brick wall? Because if you're fighting a human being, we have better methods. However, the main reason the other designs never caught on is because they lack the critical element of penetration. Hooking does not give you good penetration, and whipping gives you basically zero. Sawing and abrading, while useful in tools, only give you good penetration after a large number of back and forth passes over the same area, which, in a fight, you're simply not going to get. In terms of getting useful penetration in a single hit, thrusting, cutting, and chopping are the clear historical leaders, and there's a reason that those strategies have typically dominated the blade design for combat weapons. But keep in mind that this applies mainly to unarmored targets, which is why we see percussion and hooking weapons evolve to fight armored opponents. These weapons certainly have their uses, but they can almost never be classified as swords, which is what this video is about. Also keep in mind that while I do know quite a bit about violence, I am neither a physicist nor an engineer. While I can tell you what center of percussion is, I cannot calculate it. And if I misused a technical term, I'm sorry. I am not trained as a scientist, I'm just doing my best impression of one. So if you have a trustworthy source, please feel free to correct me in the comments. But be careful, because I've had to sort through a lot of scientific sounding nonsense to find actual answers to questions. Anyone that can tell me why this diagram is wrong gets a cookie. The reason there's so much incorrect information out there is because weaponsmiths, by and large, didn't know why certain design elements worked well. All they knew is that those weapons got good reviews and the people using them died a little less often. The differing design elements I've outlined in this video were not handed down from the beginning of time by brilliant engineers. They evolved over centuries of trial and error. It's up to us to look back and make sense of how and why these specific features withstood the test of time. It requires a knowledge of history, engineering, physics, biomechanics, sports science, and psychology, none of which I am formally qualified in. But I learned cool stuff, did my best, and therefore, no one can criticize me.